Okay, terrific. Thank you very much, Lee, for that introduction, and thank you to the organisers of this meeting and indeed this session for inviting me to come along to talk about one of my favourite topics, and that's kind of cognition, and in particular the role of cognition in our understanding and the control of food intake in humans. I was asked to provide a disclosure. I'm not a company director. I don't hold any shares in any food companies or anything like that, but I do receive some research funding from the BBSRC, which is a local UK research council, and also the EU through their 7th framework programme. Now, as has been said, I co-lead the Nutrition and Behaviour Unit, which is based in Bristol in psychology. Here are some pretty pictures of our lab. As has been said, we study food intake. We study controls of portion size, of food choice, and appetite more generally, exclusively in human. All of these topics directly or indirectly relate to a set of concerns that we all have about obesity. And I'm going to start by perhaps saying something a little bit controversial. We'll see. But I thought I'd say a few words about energy balancing and appetite. So we capture some of these ideas in a paper that's currently under review. That's Peter Rogers and I, my co-author on this paper. But essentially, here are some numbers. So a 65-kilogram woman will have around about 55 days energy supply stored in her fat tissue. So we can characterize her as a bathtub. Okay, we are large mammals walking around with a very large store of energy. But we also consume energy. And we'll think about that in terms of the amount that might be held in a saucepan. So this is our saucepan bathtub model of the role of energy balancing in appetite control. Now, it turns out that if I decide to eat a Big Mac or I decide to eat a salad, the difference that effect that has on my energy reserves is negligible. It's trivial. And so when we think about controls of appetite, it's probably the case that our body fat has a chronic effect on our appetite. Our moment-to-moment food intake is probably more directly controlled by our environment and by how full our gut currently is. So there's lots and lots of scope to try to understand, I think, how we interact with our dietary environment if we're to understand food intake in the moment. Now, my role here is to make a pitch for cognition. And I thought I'd just say a couple of words about what we mean by cognition. So I think for many of us, when we think about cognition, we think about inhibitory control. I actively decide to limit how much food I consume. And perhaps if I don't engage in that active control, then I engage otherwise in mindless eating. But I thought it might be worth saying a few words about mindless eating, because the word mindless is not really a term that psychologists, I think, readily sort of recognize and understand. In fact, there's a long tradition in psychology of distinguishing between different types of process. So on the one hand, yes, we engage in deliberative activity. We consciously introspect and attend to behaviors and problems around us. But we also contrast that in many models with automatic processing. These are so-called effortless behaviors. But I think that these behaviors are actually under very tight control precisely because they are so practiced and rehearsed. So if I learn to, and I can't do this, but if I learn to play the piano and sing and read sheet music at the same time, at that point it becomes almost effortless. But it's very, very much controlled because it is an automatic and highly practiced behavior. And psychologists have recognized for a long time that actually to expose that underlying cognition, that control, one way to do this is just to overload the system. So driving is a very difficult behavior. It's highly practiced, and then it becomes effortless. But if we overload the system, then things can go badly wrong. And I suspect the same thing happens with eating behavior. So we and others before us have looked at the effects of distraction on appetite. And this is a really very robust effect. If you distract people while they eat, then they tend to feel less full and more hungry at the end of a fixed meal. Now, I think that's really important. We don't exactly know what is going on there. We don't know what cognitive activity is involved, but I suspect it's something to do with automatic, effortless, but controlled monitoring of our food intake. There are a number of different studies that I could draw on to illustrate the fact that we probably need to monitor what we're eating, or at least know what we're eating. This is just one of my favourite. It's by Joe Cecil. It was conducted in the UK at Sheffield University. And this is a study where participants in one condition, they just ate soup normally. And what you've got plotted on the right is the hunger that was experienced after eating soup. You can see it drops down, and then over time it climbs back again. Now, the next condition is key, because this is a covert infusion. This is where you take your participants and you just infuse directly into their stomach soup. You don't tell them that you're doing this. Now, what's interesting about that is that hunger doesn't really drop down very much. And the key condition is this overt infusion condition, where you say to your participants, look, we're about to infuse soup directly into your stomach. And what you can see is that the reduction in hunger is largely restored, demonstrating that memory processes and knowing what you've eaten are probably very important. And we and others have looked and explored this role for what we call episodic memory in the control of appetite in a number of studies. Here's just one from our lab. We've got here a soup bowl, standard soup bowl, but it's connected to a peristaltic pump via a tube that goes underneath the table and into the soup bowl itself. And our participants come in, all this stuff is out of sight of the participants when they arrive, but it allows us to move soup into the soup bowl or out of the soup bowl while people eat. And we can do this covertly, so they're not even aware that this is taking place. Of course, that allows us to arrive at 4 different conditions. We've got these blue conditions. They're the congruous conditions. That's where you faithfully eat what you see. So you see 500 milliliters and you actually eat 500 milliliters. But we can set up a situation where you see 500 milliliters, and without knowing it, you only eat 300 milliliters. This is what happens. So immediately after eating soup in these conditions, actually, if you look at people's self-reported hunger, where we see differences there with respect to the physical amount of soup consumed. An hour later, actually very little difference between the conditions, but 2 or 3 hours later, I think we see something interesting. Because where we see difference between our conditions, we see them with respect to the amount that people saw when they started eating the soup, not with respect to the physical amount consumed. Again, I think very powerful evidence and a demonstration that episodic memory plays a role in determining our appetite in the intermeal interval. Of course, perhaps the most dramatic example of a role for episodic memory is found in amnesics, who engage in essentially hyperphagia, overeating. So if you give an amnesic a meal, they will eat it. 5 minutes later, they will have forgotten that meal, and they then will eat another meal, and then perhaps it becomes unethical to overfeed an amnesic. But the important point is that they experience discomfort, not fullness, because they can't ascribe, they can't attribute a visceral sensation to any event that's taken place previously. So, I've had soup many times in my life, and the reason why I have an expectation about its post-ingestive effects, and the reason why it might affect, knowing eating soup affects my appetite, is because I have a understanding of what this substance is. So you might be asking, well, where do these expectations come from? Well, certainly in rodents, that kind of anticipatory learning has been explored extensively. And when I think about this work, I think about the work of Tony Sclafani in particular. So in a very elegant paradigm, he will show that if you expose a rat to a novel flavor and then simultaneously infuse nutrients into that animal's stomach, then the animal will learn very, very quickly that there's an association between the two. And once that association is formed, the animal will orientate around that flavor, but will also use that cue to moderate its intake in the future. So learning plays a very important role. And my suspicion is that that same sort of process is alive and well and operates in meal planning in humans. Now, in a few rather simple-minded, perhaps, studies, We've looked at evidence for meal planning in humans. Do we really meal plan that often? So we've run some laboratory studies, large internet-based studies. We also had a study where we studied people's dietary behaviour in a restaurant. And all of these different approaches triangulated on the same common finding. That is that certainly in the UK and perhaps in Europe, we plan our meals about 90% of the time. So we anticipate how much we're going to eat and then essentially execute that plan. Very often that involves plate cleaning. And it was that sort of realization, I think, that meal planning is an important concept to understand that led us to develop a couple of concepts that have been helpful. One of these is called expected satiation. Now, expected satiation we're defining here as the extent to which when I see a food that I find familiar and so on, to what extent do I expect that to deliver fullness when compared with another food on a calorie-for-calorie basis? Expected satiety is another concept that we've used extensively in our work, and it's very similar, but relates to the lack of hunger. So when I see a bowl of soup, to what extent do I expect it to deliver a relief from or the absence of hunger between meals when I compare that food with another food on a calorie-for-calorie basis? And it became quite clear that we would need to measure these expectations if we're try to understand meal planning. And there are a variety of different approaches to this. Some of them involve more complex psychophysical assessment. This is just conceptually the easiest way to measure these expectations and to get the point across. Essentially, we use what's called a method of adjustment. So in this kind of paradigm, we have two foods. Here it's pizza and the UK's favourite food, curry. And the task for our participants here is imagine you having one of these food portions for lunch and you know you won't be eating again until dinner. Okay, how much curry would you need in order to stave off hunger as much as the pizza? And we've used and developed some software that allows people to elicit a response. Let's see if this works. So the participant will select a particular portion until they're comfortable and happy that a match has been made. And the key point here is that if we keep that pizza constant, that standard constant, then we can compare the expected satiety or satiation of a range of different foods. And it turns out that foods differ considerably in this regard. Now, remember I said that appetite was governed by food in the gut. Well, calorie for calorie, low energy dense foods have a greater volume. And I think it's probably for that reason that these sorts of foods, low energy dense foods, have much higher expected satiety than high energy dense foods. But it's not the case that we only see these effects when we compare new potatoes with peanut M&Ms. Actually, it turns out people have a really complex understanding of the expected satiety and satiation of food. So we and other groups have shown that people can discriminate between different types of soup based on their expected satiety and satiation, or different types of breakfast cereal. Now, we do that effortlessly, again, indicating some form of automatic but highly processed and controlled and practiced behavior. But people certainly can express these kinds of expectations. And you might be wondering, well, are these computer-based tasks actually telling us anything about everyday behavior? Well, it turns out that these assessments are pretty good predictors, actually, of the number of calories, the portion sizes that people self-select and then ultimately go on to consume. I think that there are other reasons why we should be really interested in meal planning, and perhaps interested in meal planning in children. Here is some data that are not published, that I'm writing up at the moment, but I wanted to share them with you. So we took quite a large sample of kids. So these are 217 parent and child pairs, or dyads. And we asked the kids, just select what would be your ideal portion size, and there's a range of different foods. And then what we did was we used a quintile split to just divide them according to their BMI. So these are the portions that are selected by the kids who are rather obese, and these are the kids that are quite lean. There's not really a very clear relationship between adiposity and the portions that these kids are selecting. But then we ask the parents, we'd like you to select the portions that you think your kids would like. And this is what we find. So there's a really clear relationship there between what the parents think, but not what the children think. So I think that these sorts of results are important because they might inform some sort of intervention and tell us where and what might be driving adiposity with respect to portion size and meal planning in children. You might be wondering, okay, but it's not the case that we just select portion sizes based solely on expected satiety and satiation, the post-ingestive effects of food. Palatability must play a role, surely. Well, we looked at that in a few studies, and until recently, I think I was really quite convinced that contrary to what you might call the prevailing view in this area, these expectations really were very important drivers of food intake and portion size selection and the reward value that we place on food. But very recently, I guess the last year or so, I've started to change my view on this. And I'm going to make this point by illustrating with an example, and then I'm going to present some data. So thinking now about drivers of food choice, you've got 9 foods here. Now these are all fairly familiar to folk in the UK. Ask yourself the question, which of these foods would you choose for lunch? You're not going to be eating anything for a few hours afterwards. I can tell you that these are quite small portions, so you can see there are only 100-calorie portions, they're all matched for their energy content. But about 8 out of 10 people choose either the chicken chow mein or the chicken salad. Why do they do that? Well, they're just bigger portions. Of course they're going to pick those. They're bigger portions because they're lower in energy density and they deliver greater satiety and satiation. If we increase the portion size a bit, well, I think we'd still find that we stick with those 2 foods. But if you increase the portion size, then, in fact, all of these foods are expected to sustain us, I think, between meals. And so that leads us to an interesting conclusion. With smaller portion sizes, we see that expected satiation plays an important role. What we've got here are beta weights. These are essentially a measure of the strength, the importance, the value that we place on palatability and expected satiation as drivers of our selection in that kind of context. And you can see expected satiation is about as important as palatability. But I think that if you increase the portion size, then something interesting happens. Expected satiation, its role becomes negligible, and palatability becomes the primary driver of the food choices that our participants make. And we've replicated this many, many times. And we know that people are concerned about the future and how they'll feel after they consume a meal, because if you say to them, well, okay, but now do the same thing again, but imagine that we're going to give you some of your favorite food anyway to eat. At that point, concerns about the future become irrelevant because there's going to be a large portion anyway. And you can see that across those trials, palatability remains the single most important driver of food choice. So the 2 key points, I think, from these sorts of illustrations are, first of all, that we certainly at Bristol are starting to discover ways in which we can deconstruct food choice. And we're looking at and understanding an interesting interaction between palatability, portion size, and expected satiations. What is important perhaps from a public health perspective is that larger portion sizes not only promote the consumption of larger meals, but they also might change our priorities in food choice and might lead us towards more unhealthy dietary decisions. And I just want to skirt over a couple of slides very quickly just to illustrate where we've taken this more recently, because we can develop much more sophisticated and complex models of food choice. Here's 30 different foods, and using expertise in human decision-making, we can arrive at a set of beta weights that describe, as it were, a profile of influences that appear to influence our food choice when confronted with those 30 foods. So we've got the physical characteristics of the food, number of calories in the food, the weight of the food, but also these subjective characteristics. how much we like the food, how healthy we think the foods are, how many calories we think are in the food, and how filling we think the food will be, so the expected satiation. But essentially we can, for each individual, arrive at a signature that tells us something about the drivers of their food choices. And these models are highly predictive, so on average for each individual in our studies, we can predict about 80% of their food choices before they even make them. So we're very excited by this development, and we're now looking at some obesity differences and other kinds of individual differences as well. I could talk more about that, but I want to end really with a general statement, I guess. And again, this is slightly controversial perhaps, about some of the problems I think that we face in this field. Now, I suspect that I'm as guilty as anybody else about this, but I think there is a tendency when we run studies in our labs to make claims about universal determinants of dietary behaviour. But the reality is that most of the participants that arrive in my lab are weird. So they are Western, they're educated, they come from industrialized, rich and democratic countries. And it's clear that people of that kind are actually a minority in the human population. So weird people, in several fundamental respects, their cognitive and motivational responses of these Westerners are found to be atypical. And we know that from a range of studies in psychology. I think that this sparks a set of questions that we might have about how we understand cognition and our interaction with our dietary obesogenic environment. Now, I think that one of the strong claims that is made is that our environment changes our cognition, perhaps at a population level, and perhaps in certain situations makes us more responsive to external cues. So our external cues will become hyper-responsive, and these cues then override the internal signals that otherwise regulate our appetites and food intake. One example of this, I think, is portion distortion. So there's obviously a lot of concern about portion size and the effect it has. Portion size, of course, is something that promotes overconsumption or promotes increased consumption. We tend to eat more food when we're exposed to larger portions of food. But the question that we've been thinking a little bit about is whether or not our dietary environment actually modifies, promotes this overconsumption. It changes our cognitive controls of meal size. And my suspicion is that in order to arrive at that conclusion, we need to look outside our obesogenic environment. And the logic here is that if our dietary environment makes us more sensitive to external cues, then we would expect to see less evidence for a portion size effect, or more general externality, if you like, in non-weird people. And that's precisely what we've been doing and thinking about recently. This is a nice collaboration with a chap called John Holtzman from Michigan, who's a cultural anthropologist who does work with an indigenous population in Kenya. This is the Samburu. They are semi-nomadic pastoralists who live in a very, very remote area. So they've got simple exposure to a very limited diet, milk, meat, blood that they let from their cattle, and food is scarce and there's very little dietary variety, and they have a complete absence of exposure to any kind of obesogenic environment. And our question is, well, would the Samburu be susceptible to a manipulation of an external cue, such as portion size? Now, if they are not sensitive to that kind of external cue, that would suggest that our own dietary environment has modified and has changed the cognitive controls we have over our food intake. If they are sensitive, then that would suggest that our obesogenic environment is doing something else. Here's just a picture of our lab that we set up. And we followed a very similar sort of paradigm to the paradigm that's used in weird studies. So we've got a smaller and a larger portion. They're exposed to these portions. They're quite large portions, but one is larger than the other, and they're just asked to eat as much as they like. So it's ad libitum study, as it were. Here is some data from weird people. So these are actually data from a meta-analysis. So lots and lots of studies have contributed to the data points here. both small and large portions. The take-home message is that across all of these studies, you can see there's a clear relationship. The more food you offer people, the more food they consume. Although note that that effect does tail off a little bit with really large portions. What we found in the Samburu was not an absence of a portion size effect, but really very clear evidence for a robust effect. The Samburu ate more when they were exposed to a larger portion of food relative to that small portion condition. And if you look at what happens, I've had to scale this graph down to show where we might plot those data points for the Samburu. This is those means plotted against this weird community. You can see that the Samburu are highly responsive to these kinds of external cues. I think this opens up questions about whether or not we see evidence here for less, not more sensitivity to external cues in people that have been exposed to an obesogenic environment. Perhaps we recruit some forms of inhibition, or there are forms of protection that we exhibit that they don't in that kind of environment. Okay, so the take-home message here is that I think that to appreciate our obesogenic environment, how it affects cognitive controls of food intake, we need to study exposure to external cues outside of that environment. I just want to sum up with a few just simple take-home key points here. I started by saying that, or making a pitch for understanding cognition and memory and how important cognition and memory is in influencing our appetite. I've said that I really think that meals are planned and that we need to understand that meal planning process. And in particular, we're starting to discover how important expected satiety and satiation are and how they interact with portion size in food choice. I showed how in more complex models we can really deconstruct food choice in detail, and I think that's really exciting. But we should also recognize that we're all different. To understand our obesogenic environment, it might be helpful to step outside it every now and then. I'd like to just thank these people for contributing greatly to the work that I've presented today, and to thank you for being a patient, attentive audience. Thank you very much.
Thank you for this fascinating talk, and we have a few minutes for questions. Please, everybody who has a question, go to the aisle and introduce yourself and use the microphones. Jeff, wonderful talk. So I'm very curious how if you can talk a little bit about how the reward side of food is expressed in those those remote communities. There's a lot of there's a lot of data or studies have shown that the reward side of food, is very influenced also by the presence of the environment. So how the reward of food and cravings, I mean, do they exist at all in this environment? And how all that compares to the reality in our, even at the observational level, I mean, how the reward side of food?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't have formal data, but I have personal experience and so on. Food serves much more, has much more of plays a role as a basic utility. Certainly my experience was that the Samburu are extremely Q-reactive. Food is extremely important to them. But fullness doesn't appear to be a particularly important driver of their food intake. Meat is extremely highly valued, and foods that are extremely energy dense are highly valued. So we saw very different attitudes, beliefs, and behaviours around food that suggest that our environment here and culture has fundamentally changed a lot of what we and how we respond to food. But certainly, I think the sort of wasteful attitudes that we see around food in this kind of environment are clearly very, very different, and there's certainly much more reverence and concern about food waste and its value in that kind of culture, perhaps as you might expect.
Good morning, Dr. Jeff. Mauro Fisber from Brazil. I would like that you comment about children. Do they have the same relationship with the portion size that they are offered, or this depends on the cultural environment and different things, and that if they are learning their behavior, they do behave differently than adults?
Wow, that's a complicated question. It is clear that children do have an ability to articulate a portion size that they would prefer in advance. So one of our observations of kids has been that they actually quite enjoy the sorts of tasks that we use, and they feel very comfortable selecting portion sizes that are appropriate for them. What we don't know very much about is how they make that transition, I would say, from essentially being dictated by their parents or from their parents to that period of independence, and at what point developmentally perhaps they move and make that transition could be extremely important. It is clear that portion size influences the amount of food that adults consume, and there are now many studies showing exactly the same sort of principle at work in children.
Thanks very much for a wonderful talk. I wondered if you're planning on studying the number of different foods, particularly at a meal, and whether the combined effect of several affects these variables.
It's a really great question, and yes, we have. We got one paper published actually on variety. So again, I suppose I started by showing a picture of somebody trying to do their makeup and listening to a mobile phone and then trying to drive at the same time. I think exactly the same argument can be applied here. So what is the limit of our cognitive capacity? To what extent can we integrate expectations when we're confronted with a variety of different foods, say at a buffet? But actually, I think we can extend that even further, and we can say, so what is the limit of my understanding when I'm exposed to 20 different varieties of baked beans? And that's an issue that we've been looking at, and we've got a couple of papers where we think about the problems that we might encounter and whether or not we, as it were, sort of max out. We reach an upper limit on our ability to be able to draw on this prior experience when making food and portion size decisions. So yes, the answer is we have done some of that work, but I'm even more excited to do more of that work in future, because I think that's really very important and tells us something important about our how I don't like to use the word process, but how manufactured varieties affects these sorts of very basic processes.
So you showed some data suggesting there was a big portion effect, even if you look cross-culturally, and obviously there's portion effects in children as well. My question is this a biological thing? Do you see portion effects in animal models?
I'm not aware of a large literature on portion size effects in animals, and that's partly because it's a complicated question. I suspect that one of the reasons for that is that the portion size effect is probably controlled and influenced to an extent by a manipulation of normative beliefs about portion size that isn't evident in animals that tend to eat in a more ad libitum fashion. So the short answer is no, there isn't a widely held view that the portion size effect is evident in other species.
Perfect. Thank you very much for your talk, Jeff.